I'm going to take you through where we are on a new project in the inclusive framework on global mobility. And very interested to hear your reactions because a bit like what Pierce was talking about in the previous session, we're also in an early stage of gathering input and shaping the work so that it meets the needs of members. So very interested to hear your perspectives as well about what you see as the most interesting for your country. I'll take you through a recap of what the inclusive framework agreed on this topic. I'll take you through briefly some of the messages coming out from a literature review on global mobility. I'll talk about some of the tax questions that arise that we're hearing from members and from business, and then I'll touch on the next steps, and then wait to see if we've got some questions and answers. As we go through, the things that I'd be really interested to hear from you are what are the opportunities that you see from global mobility of work? And I should say, when we're talking about global mobility of work, what we're referring to is the sort of changes in the way that we work, at least for some kinds of jobs, which make it much easier to work remotely, to work cross-border remotely, as well as more economic integration and ease of travel that means people can also physically cross borders. And so this is about the mobility of workers as well as the mobility of work itself. And so we're interested in hearing about the opportunities that you see from global mobility, as well as the risks that you might see to your jurisdiction from global mobility of work, and which tax issues you see as the most relevant for us to try and tackle together in the inclusive framework. So to start with a recap of the outcomes of the inclusive framework meeting. So this was the plenary in April this year, and we had a very broad cross-section of interest in this topic. We had a lot of different perspectives and interest from all different regions in the world, where I think there was a recognition that there is something, a trend in changes in how we work. The idea that for some kinds of jobs, if you've got a laptop and an internet connection, increasingly you could be anywhere in the world, and trying to think about what are the tax implications of that. And we saw interest from different kinds of countries, countries where there's economic integration and where it's very easy for people to cross borders, countries where the land borders are easy to cross, as well as countries where, in particular, there's demographic change and there's a young population, for example, in Africa, and recognizing that young people in particular, and young people adopting technology and seeking opportunities anywhere, that this might have implications in terms of what it means for opportunities for young people going forward. And so we had a very big cross-section of interest in taking forward work on this topic. The approach that was agreed on this topic was a three-phased approach. I think similar to the approach taken on tax inequality and growth. So first, and this is where we are now, is to study and scope the work. So the idea here is we're examining the types of issues that arise, the types of changes in the nature of work, and thinking through all of the different tax issues that might arise. And we've been doing that by collecting information from the Inclusive Framework members. We're engaging with the relevant working parties in the Inclusive Framework. So we've talked to our experts on tax treaties, on transfer pricing, on VAT, on dispute resolution, and on tax policy and statistics, just to gather all of the different insights and experiences on this topic. We're also engaging with other stakeholders and particularly business about how this mobility of workers and mobility of work is affecting their business, and what are the tax issues that they see. And we'll also be very shortly launching a public consultation to gather input as widely as we can on all of the different tax issues that arise. The idea is then having gone through a sort of listening phase to look at all of the different issues, is that we take to the inclusive framework at the next plenary a work plan going forward, sort of recognizing that we can't work on every issue all at once. We need to come up with a structured work plan for what are the priority issues and how can we take forward that work. And that could include areas where we need to gather further evidence or do further study to better understand the implications. Um, and then in a third phase, if and when we come up with particular solutions, those are then available for members to implement. One of the things we've been doing is a literature review just to understand better what we know about global mobility of work and what the trends and the economic impacts suggest about this. And although there's a range of different studies and surveys, what that suggests is that we're seeing that domestic remote working is firmly in place. And so, of course, we saw a very sudden increase in remote working during the COVID pandemic. But what the literature suggests is that after COVID, we've not returned to pre-COVID levels. It's actually stabilized at a higher rate, the domestic remote working. At the same time, that sort of change in technology and change in employee preferences and demands to be able to work from home at least some of the time, we also see a change in the types of jobs that are able to be done fully remotely. And so, for example, the World Economic Forum estimates that in the next 5 years, there will be a 25% increase in the types of jobs that are able to be done remotely from anywhere. And that's particularly in sectors like IT and finance and services. At the same time, there's some suggestions that digital nomadism is on the rise. So that's the idea that you could have people, because of the nature of the type of work they do, with an internet connection and a laptop, could be anywhere in the world, and in fact are able to travel to multiple jurisdictions in the year. And so are really resident nowhere and earning income from all over the world. Um, but actually quite hard to capture in terms of your tax base. We also see suggestions that cross-border remote working is increasing in prevalence. So this is the idea that not just working from home in the same jurisdiction as your employer, but working abroad in a different jurisdiction from your employer remotely. So, for example, that could be because you're working as an add-on to a holiday abroad. It could be because you're working because you have caring responsibilities in another jurisdiction, and it could be just because of employee preference. And so we're seeing increased prevalence of that, but also with limitations because business is concerned about exposure to some of the tax risks that we'll talk about next. We also see that in in certain areas of the world, traditional cross-border working, so the frontier workers that are physically traveling across borders, living in one and crossing the border where that border is quite close, that's a significant part of the population in some areas. So we've, of course, seen that in Europe for some time because of economic integration. And that continues to be a significant part of the population and something that's also increased in recent years. At the same time, when we've done our literature review, we've also looked at some of the wider economic trends and early evidence of impact from global mobility of work. And some of the wider economic trends we're thinking about include more regional economic integration. So, of course, we've had that in the EU for some time, but there's also moves in the Caribbean and Africa looking forward to more regional integration. which may suggest that the mobility of work and mobility of workers might actually increase over time. There's also some suggestions from the World Economic Forum that when you think about demographic change, and the location of working age individuals, whereas at the moment they're relatively evenly spread between different types of economies, in the next 20 years, it's estimated that the distribution of workers would be 60% in lower income economies and 40% in higher income economies. And when you put that together with aging populations, in some of the OECD countries, and very young populations in some of the emerging economies, that may suggest that there may be more of a demand and more of a need to access employees from outside your own country because of the distribution of where workers are located. And so again, we may see a trend that suggests more global mobility of work as we look forward. There's some suggestions in terms of the potential impacts here, that global mobility of work is actually a positive thing in terms of growth potential. So there are some suggestions that it can increase firm productivity and innovation. And that's because of the ability to access a global pool of talent, because of changes in the way we work, and where you're able to attract workers that want to work in a different location. That access to a global pool of talent may actually be very beneficial for growth. There's also some suggestions that it's important for employee satisfaction, and particularly as some employees are managing caring responsibilities or have family connections in different locations. The ability to work remotely or work in a different country may increase worker retention, and therefore, again, may be important for productivity and growth. There's some evidence of positive wage impacts as employees are able to access jobs on a global market, but overall that remains understudied. But at the same time, we know that that sort of potential for positive impacts will also depend on the clarity, certainty, design, and administrability of the tax rules here. So overall, I think the what we're hearing and seeing is that there's been a clear trend in increase in global mobility of work that may in fact increase over the coming years, and this all could be very positive for growth. But it does depend on us being able to consider whether there are ways we need to provide more guidance or stability on some of the tax rules to facilitate those opportunities. So if we turn to then some of the tax questions that arise, and we've looked at this in terms of both corporate income tax and personal income tax. When we think about the corporate income tax issues, some of the questions that we're hearing from business and from our own members include residence questions. So could the presence of senior executives or management, if they're working abroad, could that affect the residence of the company itself, particularly if the residence rule is based on place of effective management? Are there questions about permanent establishment, for example, where you have employees teleworking in one or more foreign jurisdictions, and when might that lead to the creation of a permanent establishment? And here I'll note we've just last week released the 2025 update to the Model Tax Convention, which includes new guidance on the issue of a home office PE, and what are the circumstances in which an employee working from home would or would not create a permanent establishment. But there may also be other areas where the presence of employees working abroad could give rise to questions about permanent establishment. So for example, contract concluding agents or services PE. There's also a question then about profit attribution. So if you do have a permanent establishment created by an employee teleworking abroad, how do you attribute profits to such a PE? There's other questions about transfer pricing, for example, where you have intercompany arrangements between associated enterprises because you've got employees whose activities are benefiting enterprises across jurisdictions. So if you've got an employee responsible for all of the enterprises in a particular region, how do you recognize and price those transactions? And along the way, we're also thinking about what are the administrative burdens that arise from the current rules. Things like multiple filing obligations, multiple withholding obligations. What tax certainty and simplification measures could assist here to provide more clarity and burden reduction? When we think about also the personal income tax side of things, some of the questions that arise include when the presence of an individual, when the presence in an individual in more than one jurisdiction could lead to dual tax residence. So, for example, if they're working in one jurisdiction and living in the other, and they may meet the conditions based on time spent in one jurisdiction. They may meet the conditions for residents based on their connections. And do the current rules resolve those questions in a way that's easy to administer? There's also questions about tax residence, where an individual might be in multiple jurisdictions in a year and not meet any of the thresholds or tests for residence and might have no tax residence. And is that something we need to be looking at? Is that prevalent and is that something we need to address? There's other questions about the taxation of employment income. So, for example, where you might have more than one jurisdiction seeking to tax employment income, for example, where an employee lives in one place but works in the other, or when they're working for a foreign employer and then physically visits that employer, and there can be tax obligations that arise even from a one-day visit. And is that something we need to think about? We're also receiving questions about the implications of special regimes that are designed to attract mobile workers, such as digital nomads. And there we see questions both about the positive spillovers. Are these good for growth? Are these good for attracting employees where you need, where particularly for smaller economies where there's a need to attract employees? Or are there negative spillovers in terms of tax competition? And is that something that we need to perhaps study further to understand better? Again, we're also mindful of the compliance and tax administration issues along the way. Are there administrative burdens here that are limiting the opportunities for global mobility of work or that are burdensome for individuals or businesses? And could we provide more certainty and simplification, particularly for short-term temporary working abroad? So those are some of the questions that we're hearing and when thinking about. In terms of the next steps, we're continuing to consult with government, with business, and academics. We will have a public consultation, so we will launch a consultation document, a call for written input, hopefully tomorrow, and then have a consultation event in January. That will be a hybrid event, so you're very welcome to tune in and contribute to that event. And then based on that, we will synthesize all of the inputs we've had, and with a view to then taking forward a work plan to the inclusive framework to take forward. So as I said, here are some of the questions I'd be interested to hear from you, as well as any other reactions or questions. Whether this is an area where you do see opportunities for the businesses in your jurisdiction or the employees in your jurisdiction to be able to access new opportunities for employment. Whether you see particular risks to your jurisdiction based on how the current tax rules work, and whether there's a need to facilitate or protect against tax risks and coordinate together. And in particular, of those tax issues that I've mentioned, certainly if there's other issues that you see, but also which of these you would see as the most important for us to start working on together and providing more guidance, clarity, and solutions on.